I'm Albu, I'm all about improving gaming performance, so let's skip the long intro and let's optimize our graphic settings for the Caldera map. First up is streaming quality, which can only be toggled between low and high before actually launching a Warzone match. This setting has nothing to do with the quality of anything. It simply defers the loading of rarely used textures until they are needed. But for now, know this. All streaming quality does is save you a little VRAM when set to low. This is hard to benchmark because I have to restart the game and get the exact same flight path. So here we are, and we notice it does not make a big difference right at the start of the game. However, if we skip ahead a little bit, we can see it slowly adding up over time. This is in line with my previous testing on the Verdansk map. So as long as you're not hitting a VRAM bottleneck, which happens on 95% VRAM use, you won't experience any performance differences. There is another important bottleneck to watch out for here, which I'll explain with the next setting. Visually, there will be no difference. You may have heard it affects the range that textures load in. That is not true at all. We covered that in more depth as well on the previous Warzone video. Recommendation is still to set this one to low. Texture resolution. I've come to realize from my Verdansk video that it's a very misunderstood setting. I intend to make us experts on this setting right now. First, let's start with the differences in visuals. Texture resolution improves our gloves from very low to normal, but not on high. It also affects our weapon skins from very low to low. However, the improvement on normal is almost indistinguishable at 1080p. We can also notice the ground texture difference on the ground here. The reason we don't notice this on the higher settings is because it's distance based and too far from the camera. So let's continue forward and see what difference texture resolution makes to objects such as this truck. This is the closest that a difference is noticeable, but quite frankly requires a magnifying glass at this range. I'll slow down the clips here as many subtle details become apparent. The real question is, when does high actually make a difference? And the answer is when we're up close and intimate with the texture, preferably with the magnifying glass. What I want you to take from this clip is that high comes at a very hefty cost in video RAM for differences that would not be noticed during normal gameplay. But more importantly, I want to stress how little noticeable differences there is from low to normal as well. Another way to see how texture resolution affects our view is next to a wall like this. It makes a big difference up close, but that difference quickly diminishes at a relatively close range. This brings us to the more important aspect of texture resolution, performance. You may have noticed that high has an FPS drop here, but did not in the previous clip. The misunderstanding here is that texture resolution will only affect performance if it increases the amount of video RAM required past what is available. That's not always the case for Warzone. This is because Warzone's game engine is designed to stream a very large map, and the high setting here hits a streaming bandwidth bottleneck, even on this RTX 3080. It's worth noting this is situational and only happens in about half the locations I tested. What is really surprising is that this actually happens across all video cards similarly. For example, even if I run this test on my lowest end test bench, a GTX 1060, it still encounters the same FPS drop on high. To be thorough, in case you didn't catch it in my Verdansk video, texture resolution won't affect your ability to see enemies, but it does have a tiny improvement on their textures at a very close range.
By the way, a couple of important things to be aware of. If you ever see textures that look particularly bad, such as this, it's not due to your texture resolution setting, although changing it often will fix it temporarily. What's actually happened is the texture file has become corrupted. This is actually rather common for Warzone, and most every player will at some point experience some corrupted files in this game. The proper fix is easy. Go to battle.net launcher, click the gear icon, select Scan and Repair, and begin scan. You should be doing this regularly, regardless if you experience any problems. At least for Warzone, most other games don't experience corrupt textures nearly as often. Also, you should never trust this estimated video RAM usage bar. It's not just inaccurate, it's extremely misleading.
You can use Windows Task Manager, Performance, and select your GPU to see if you are near your VRAM limit. Performance will start dropping at 95% VRAM utilization. Final recommendation is going to be normal, but depending on your video card's amount of video RAM, you may want to use low to make sure you're not reaching a VRAM bottleneck. Now I know some of you will say, but Albu, I run amazing textures with the same video card in other games and it's super smooth. And you're right, a single player game like Doom or Shadow of the Tomb Raider is far more detailed and smooth, but you're not running Doom on Warzone's Infinity Ward game engine, which is optimized for mass online players, so you can't expect anywhere near the same level of detail or performance. If in doubt, set texture resolution low. Graphically, it's hard to notice the difference from normal to low during gameplay. Very low does have a very noticeable loss in texture quality, but should still be used for video cards with very little video RAM to avoid a VRAM bottleneck. Next, Texture Filter Anisotropic enhances the texture quality on distant surfaces at oblique viewing angles. To overly simplify this is how far detailed textures on some floors and walls will be crisp and clear. At a resolution of 1080p, it's rather hard to see the improvement for high, but it's there. This setting is not demanding in terms of performance for modern video cards, so as expected, we see no FPS difference. Set this one to high and enjoy improved visuals at no performance cost. Particle quality is more noticeable on the Caldera map than it was in Verdansk. That's because these dust particles are rather common on this map. Unfortunately for people with dust allergies, sometimes these dust particles can be dense enough to affect visibility, so making them smaller is rather beneficial for us. The more important role of particle quality is to stop particle-based graphics from distorting objects in front of them. Makes the 0 to 2% FPS cost well worth it. Of course, this setting also improves the quality of particle-based graphics, such as the poison cloud itself, although, honestly, you'd never really notice this. And yes, this does affect all particle effects, such as smoke grenades, which will also look better when enabled. By the way, did you notice the smoke's volumetric effect is identical if the grenade is thrown and lands the same? That's not common in most games. Particle quality is sometimes slightly more costly in terms of FPS than it was on the Verdansk map. I assume this is probably due to the increased use of trees and their fine foliage, as well as the increased use of dust particles floating about. Recommendation is to set this one to high. Bullet impact and spray hasn't changed since Verdansk, but there are some confusions about the spray part of its name, so let's clear that up. There is no difference in firearm smoke, firearm fire, or anything related to the spraying of the firearm. The dust animation where the bullet lands is also the same. The only difference this setting makes is to the bullet impact mark. The higher your renderer worker count, generally the higher the CPU usage is for this setting. I covered how to set your worker renderer count in the previous Warzone benchmark video. Check video description below for the link. Set this one to disabled because it won't help you spot where your bullet is landing anyway. Tessellation affected textures was extremely rare to find in the previous map. In Caldera, it seems they may have completely removed tessellation. At least I wasn't able to find a single example this time around. If you find one, comment below and I'll test it out. Such updates and results will be added to the video description below. We might as well set it to disabled because it doesn't make a difference. Dismemberment and Gore Effects has been re-added to the graphics settings menu, but it's deceivingly named. As much as you'd like to dismember your opponent's head, it's not going to happen. No, you can't dismember any limbs either. Rockets don't even have gore effects. Okay, so what does gore effects change? Well, that's kinda misleading too. They affect how corpses take bullets by adding some blood splatter. Normally, this would be great, a visual so you know you hit your target. But after conducting my tests on live targets, well, it seems gore effects only affects corpses. I know you missed that, so here it is in slow motion. Performance impact is negligible on live targets as well as corpses. Recommendation will be disabled, not for a minuscule performance difference, but because it's beneficial to be able to tell if a target is dead, since it'll stop splattering blood. It's not a bad indicator to have at all, as long as you're aware of this mechanic. Filmic Strength has a subtle use. It removes some of the visual noise created by the use of screen space reflections, or depth of field. Some, not all. To be more accurate, it depends on the type of light being reflected on the firearm. In some cases, the visual noise won't be improved at all. By the way, if you use DLSS instead of anti-aliasing, visual noise like this becomes very minimal in all scenarios. Combine that with the improved anti-aliasing from DLSS and, well, the whole scene looks far better. Recommendation will remain setting it to 1 because it only affects performance when it's improving the visuals, and it does improve our visibility, especially if you're using depth of field. Up next, we have Film Grain, which adds grain to the lobby screen. That's it. In a Warzone Battle Royale, it has no effect, and obviously as a result, FPS isn't affected either. We can comfortably set this one to disabled as well. For NVIDIA DLSS, I have a dedicated video that goes into detail as to why you should be using DLSS and how to set it correctly based on your video card and its tensor core count. Link to it is in the description below, and I highly recommend it because there's too many incorrect widespread myths about DLSS out there. However, Caldera is a new map, so we are going to give DLSS a quick benchmark run and look for evidence of any big changes. An RTX 3080 is the best choice for this, you'll see why in a minute. Firstly, with DLSS, there is a big change, and it has to do with the issue I pointed out on the previous Verdansk map, with trees not being upscaled properly and looking a lot like Minecraft, which seems to have been greatly improved on for Caldera. I wonder if my previous video may have nudged them to fix that. Secondly, if we look at the FPS performance difference, it seems to be right on par with my previous results from the previous map, where the 3080 is just barely hitting that tensor core count bottleneck threshold at 1080p. I think it's safe to say it doesn't merit retesting on all video cards again, as the results would be very similar. So you can use the same results from my DLSS analysis video to decide on which DLSS option you should be using. A quick recap. Disabled anti-aliasing has pixelated, blocky edges, and as we move towards SMAA, Filmic, we mostly get a lot of blurring. DLSS has a sharper, crisper edges with an impressively clear image on quality. For a full analysis and benchmarking of DLSS in Warzone, check the link in the description. It's a video I highly recommend. Because there's a lot of DLSS myths out there, and the truth is that DLSS will improve your frame rate performance and your visuals with superior anti-aliasing. Differences are quite significant. Up next is anti-aliasing, and it remains the same blurry mess on Filmic as always, and the same jagged edge pixelated mess on disabled. The super sampling anti-aliasing you'd be getting from DLSS would be a much better choice than any of these. But if you don't have an RTX card, your best choice will be one of the two middle choices here. 1X has minimal blur and is a great choice if you don't mind the flickering jagged edges. Personally, I'd suggest SMAA T2X and adding a little sharpness to remove the blur effect. Unfortunately, NVIDIA has removed the beloved sharpness option from their control panel, but they can't remove your monitor's hardware sharpness, so you can still use that. There is another alternative, the new image scaling option in NVIDIA control panel also enables a sharpness filter. It's not the same as the old setting, but it does increase sharpness. I will dedicate a benchmark video to this setting in the future because it does a lot more than just increase sharpness. Given that the FPS performance ranges from almost nothing to a few percent on modern video cards, the final recommendation will depend on visuals. So if you don't have DLSS, we recommend SMAA 2X with the addition of a little sharpness, preferably from your monitor's hardware buttons, to get rid of any blur it introduces. By the way, if you do use DLSS, do not add any extra sharpness from any other source. DLSS has its own sharpness filter built in, and stacking it with sharpness from any other source will result in highly contrasted colors on texture edges, which will cause ghosting on most monitors during motion. I do recommend sharpeners with regular anti-aliasing, but not with DLSS. Depth of field only works when aiming down sights. It adds blurring to nearby objects as well as our firearm. Depending on your positioning in relation to immediate objects, it can even cause blurring on distant scenery. More often than not, this blur is actually more of a pixelated graininess that takes away some of our visibility. By the way, this graininess can be partially corrected using Filmic Strength. It restricts our vision and costs us a frame or two, so definitely set this one to off. World motion blur hasn't changed since the previous map. A quick pause and we see it adds a poor blur effect along with some even worse graininess. Literally, all it does is make it harder to see enemies during motion. Using this setting can give the impression of smoother motion, but don't be fooled. It will put you at a big disadvantage since you don't see as well. Alright, let's move on before we get dizzy. Weapon motion blur adds blur to the movement of your firearm. This happens when you're running. It's more noticeable if I slow down the recording. It also happens when you're making quick aim movements. This blur is costing us a couple of frames per second, so it's definitely not worth it. Anyway, now that I have you a little dizzy and lightheaded, it's probably a good time to ask you to hit that subscribe button. It's right down there and it's the only way this channel will make it. So we can optimize the settings for your favorite games. Alright, enough of that. Shadow map resolution has three important aspects to consider. Visually, it displays crisper and less blurry shadows on extra high. To be honest, the difference isn't that big, especially at close range. Second is that it uses more video RAM for the higher settings. Now, the third and probably most important aspect of the setting is that performance will range from no difference to having a slight increase in FPS for the higher settings. I know this is odd, but it's normal for modern video cards that can handle a larger shadow map size. Basically, in order to blur and soften the shadows on the low setting, multiple shadow map lookups are performed, which sometimes cost us a couple of frames. Recommendation will be high because very high tends to use a lot of video RAM and the shadows are unnaturally sharp. However, if you have a video card that is lower than an NVIDIA 1000 series or is older than about 7 years, you should set this to low, since most cards made prior to that time generally won't handle larger sized shadow maps well, and as a result the performance trend here would reverse. Cache spot shadows will not have a visual difference. It's all about the numbers for this one. It uses a little more video RAM to preload some shadow data for quicker rendering access. This translates to about 1% more FPS while standing still. However, during motion, it provides an even bigger difference. Biggest difference I was able to get was this clip here, which is about 5%, which is right on par with the Verdansk map. So definitely keep this one enabled. Cache sun shadows seems far more beneficial than it was on the old map. This is likely due to an increase in the amount of shadows on this map. It still generally only costs you up to 200 megabytes in video RAM to enable the setting.
The FPS difference is often in the 10 to 15% range.
It doesn't even matter if we're indoors, we can still gain just as many frames. it seems to be more dependent on the actual location on the map. The FPS gain isn't always drastic. This particular test got me about a 5% FPS increase, probably because we're on the edge of the map. By the way, I even tested intentionally VRAM bottlenecking myself, and this setting still provided an FPS increase, so there should be no reason to ever disable this even on low-end video cards with a low amount of video RAM. It was 2 to 6% on the Verdansk map, so this one was a bit of a surprise. Particle lighting is very easy to explain. This is what it's supposed to do. If we replicate that picture, we can see it in action. I know you didn't see it, and Activision is counting on that, because if you had slow-mo vision, you'd see that this setting doesn't actually work. We can cross-confirm this from the frame rate performance. Plus, I tested it thoroughly last season, where it did nothing. It's not surprising this setting is still permanently disabled. Its effects would be too hard to notice, and particle lighting would certainly impact performance negatively. Recommendation is disabled, even if it does nothing. Ray tracing is amazing technology. It is, without doubt, the future for reflections in games, as the difference in graphics is huge. However, few games actually implement the full power of ray tracing properly. Warzone in particular implements absolutely nothing that ray tracing has to offer. There is no ray tracing available in Warzone, so the game looks the same and the frame rate is the same. This setting is just here for show. It does nothing. Might as well set it to disabled. Ambient Occlusion is a different technique for shadow rendering. Instead of the typical method of rendering a shadow cast by an object, such as the pillar casting this shadow, Ambient Occlusions works backwards, by darkening areas of a texture directly. It does this by estimating how exposed the texture is to nearby light. The result is you gain shadows such as these, that really make objects pop and look much more realistic. This technique also has the added effect of making most existing shadows darker. By the way, there is no such thing as dynamic objects in Warzone. Even though cars, planes, and such do move, they are still considered static objects. Essentially, dynamic is the same setting as disabled, and both is the same setting as adding static ambient shadows. Recommendation is disabled because it's just not worth the performance impact. Screen space reflections adds reflections to reflective surfaces. Most important in my opinion is windows, because contrary to what you may have read online, they do in fact become reflective. Windows aren't reflective when you look directly at them, but from the side, starting at about this angle, they do become reflective. I consider this the most important aspect of the setting because given the right conditions and location, it can certainly impair your vision of targets. All those shiny tile and marble reflections you see on floors are simulated reflections and will not be affected by screen space reflections. All the blue water in Caldera that looks like it's flowing also gains a subtle reflection if set above disabled, albeit a very poor one. Realistically, it just changes from a clear blue to a more accurate hue color of the sky. Puddles, such as this one, are even more rare in Caldera than the previous map. They do gain a reflection on low, although it's a poorly generated still image. On medium and high, they are an accurate real-time reflection, but often a grainy one. The one thing about medium and high is that they will reflect characters and other objects, but chances are it would never help you spot an enemy sooner. This swampy region is the only place that truly uses a lot of screen space reflection, so it's probably the best location to do a motion benchmark. Result is over a 5% FPS loss. Also, you can see here how moving objects such as a car or any enemy character gain a reflection on medium and high. If Warzone had real ray tracing instead, there would be no grain and the reflection would be crystal clear. Recommendation remains disabled because it's a competitive game and it provides us nothing substantial. Meanwhile, if we want reflections of enemies, it would be an expensive setting performance-wise. Don't forget to check out my DLSS analysis video. It's particularly surprising and has the potential to significantly improve your game. I hope this video helps you improve your gaming experience. Please don't forget to like and subscribe as I make videos for many games to optimize your settings. Till next time, happy gaming.